Train drivers of Reddit, what is the strangest thing you've seen on the tracks? My husband is a train conductor, and he said crackheads periodically like to get on the tracks next to this trailer park, and occasionally they've almost got hit. A couple years ago, a man parked his truck on the tracks and committed suicide. It was pretty sad. He was only 27 and had just lost custody of his kids in a divorce. My husband said the impact was so hard that it crushed his truck up pretty bad, but his head and torso were still intact, but there was blood and beer cans everywhere. Other than that, he's only ever seen a bunch of wildlife. I grew up in a railroad town in WNY. Suicide by train isn't very uncommon. You hear about at least one a year. One of them hit closer to home than normal. A guy that my dad sold land to drove down the hill in his Jeep into my backyard. He was extremely drunk and destroyed the front end of his Jeep. My dad told him to go home, and he started crying that his wife left him. My dad still told him to just go home and get some rest. The guy didn't say anything about wanting to die, so my dad didn't say anything. I was home visiting that weekend. I live 5 hours from my parents. When I was getting ready to leave, I read the newspaper, and it said that the guy who was in my parents' yard the other day committed suicide by train. According to a friend of mine whose dad is with the town police, deputy stepped out from his vehicle, walked out onto the tracks, and waved at the train as it ran him over. It was super weird to me, because you could still see his Jeep tracks in my parents' lawn from a few days before. Not subway, but London's Docklands Light Railway. They used to have a shutdown every August bank holiday. It gave 3 clear days, where major works and repairs could be undertaken from the Saturday morning through to the Tuesday morning. We were putting new equipment trackside, and on the Saturday morning we were walking along the track measuring distances etc, ready to do the install of equipment on the Sunday and Monday. As we were walking, we noticed a woman laid across the tracks with her head on one rail and her feet on the other. Of notice that the DLR has a 500 VDC third rail, which of course was off due to the shutdown. Also, the trains are automatic and have no driver most of the time. We walked towards the woman, who had seen us but didn't do anything. When we were close, we asked her what she was doing and told her she couldn't be here. It's illegal to trespass on the railway in the UK. That turned her head and said, "I've had enough, next train coming is going to end it for me." I said, "Well, you're going to have to wait until Tuesday, love. There's no trains this weekend." She got up and stormed off complaining about bloody trains. 15-year railroader here. I once saw a homeless guy getting a blowjob from a toothless addict next to the tracks in Nashville. Also one I didn't personally witness, but used to be a common occurrence just north of Birmingham, Alabama, was a lady who would stand next to the tracks in a trench coat with a photographer, and when the train was going by or right before, would get completely naked for a photo shoot. Another legend is the Chapel Hill Ghost Light in Chapel Hill, Tennessee. Supposedly, a long time ago, a conductor got ran over by a train and decapitated. Now, after a train goes by, a mysterious light can be seen going down the tracks and even cross from side to side. Legend has it, it is the conductor looking for his head. I've never seen it, since it is only after the train goes by that it comes out. My uncle swears that he saw it multiple times back in the 70s or back '80s though. How did you know she was toothless? Well, as went by kinda slow because of a speed restriction. She stopped, looked up at us and smiled. He then promptly grabbed the back of her head and guided it back down to complete the task at hand. My grandfather on my mother's side has an eerie story about this. He drove trains back in the early 70s to the late 80s. He mostly stayed around the southeast area where we live. One night while he was going through an intensely forested area, he noticed that in the distance it looked really bright. like daytime. It was in the middle of the night, probably 3 AM. He describes it like he was seeing the end of a cave. So he keeps going on, has not about to stop an entire train. He reaches the light about 2 minutes after he sees it, and it's simply daytime. He checks his clock and it still says 3 AM. He says there were clouds in the sky and everything. He goes past an ice barn and some farmland with cows and everything seems normal. Has blinking hard trying to figure it out, and then he goes back into some trees and it's night again. Never happened again. He did travel through that area again during the day and nothing seemed out of place other than the barn seeming a bit more weathered, and there weren't any cows, but that could just be because it was a different barn. Old barns are common out here. He isn't a superstitious person. He's very skeptical about anything that's not science or religion, so this story has always stuck with me. Never explained. Probably a meteorite burning in. If the size and trajectory was right, they can be like a giant flare lighting everything up. Not a driver, but have a wholesome one. A relative of mine is a depot clerk and some guys brought in ticketons they found in a boxcar. Young enough that their eyes hadn't opened yet. She ended up in a foster to adopt situation. Named the boy Carson, because he's the son of a boxcar, and the girl Madison, because that's where the train had come out of. If you have access to photos, you must pay the cat tax. I have a screenshot of a collage my sister posted, but can't figure out how to get it here. Not so strange but memorable. We went on school trips by train maybe a dozen or so times, mostly to museums and the like. We always were excited when we passed a certain city, because right after the station there was a brothel right next to the tracks. The windows were facing the trains and there were always women sitting in the windows, smoking and talking to each other in various stages nudity. That was boring and nobody cared anymore once students hit age 14 or so, but before that, you could see conversations stop and teens craning their necks once we left that specific train station, just to get a chums on some boobs. After that it was back to business as usual. Edit. It is late here. I didn't notice the question was for train drivers. I'm not. I only rode the train. Oh well. Bruxelles Nord, if I remember correctly. I do. Maybe, but I'm talking about Dusseldorf HBF. Not a conductor or my story, but it's a crazy one. I think it was AskReddit that had one a couple of weeks ago asking crime scene cleanup crews about the worst thing they've ever seen, and someone commented and said they had to clean up a body that had committed suicide by train. They looked everywhere for the head and couldn't find it, so eventually they took the body to the morgue. The examiner happens to see a wisp of hair coming out of the chest and looks closer and see that the guy wasn't decapitated, but his head was shoved down into his body like he dove into the oncoming train. I've seen a lot of stuff in law enforcement, but that one got an audible what the fuck out of me. On scene looking after the train crew. After they have been taken home in a taxi we had to move train to get the body out. I can confirm this as I've seen the police do the same thing looking for the head and the cleanup guys found it in his chest cavity. Yeah, that was definitely an unforgiving post, but that comment is gonna sit with me forever. It gave me a lot of perspective though, especially on how traumatizing a suicide can be for loved ones if they are tasked with cleaning you up. Definitely made me say that if I'm gonna cut my own cord I'm gonna do it in a place owned by the city or state. Not a train driver, but former Wendy's employee who needs to share my story. Closing up at 11 PM, coworker goes out for smoke and comes back freaking out. There was a naked homeless guy laying in the middle of the track next to the store jacking off and screaming like he was in pain. This track is often used as it runs straight through town. Anyone heard of Aurora, Illinois? So many trains. So we called the cops, and he was completely unresponsive to them. Still screaming and jerking it. Guy's completely paralyzed all over, stiff as a board. They call paramedics and they put him on a stretcher. Still locked up, jacking and screaming. Turns out dude was like a human crack rock, and that's what he was. This surprised me until you mentioned it, Tora. That explains everything. What's a human crack rock? I have never heard this expression before. It means he's so high on crack that he's essentially partly paralyzed.